How's it going, American history students? Mr. Bell coming back at you with another video lesson. This one's a little weird because it is the beginning of American 2, at least the first two sections of American 2, little sections, and it's the end of American 1. So there's a bit of an overlap here, and what this covers is like the Wild West post-Civil War. So a lot of the end to the battles between the cowboys and Indians, to sound really cliche. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. But you have overlap between the end of American 1 and the beginning of American 2. Now, for the purposes of this semester that I'm recording it, due to a shortened semester because of COVID-19 in the fall of 2020, which eventually will date this video a little bit, but the material will still be good. This is going to cover that last little part of, or as I like to call it, Unit 7.5 of American History 1. Now, will we get to this in class? I think maybe. On the very last day of class, we can get to this and get through all the, technically all the material in the curriculum. But if we don't, you have this video. And you're going to cover this, especially if you have me for American History 2, you're going to cover it at the beginning of American 2. So you're not going to miss out on the material, because even if we don't get to it in class, you'll have the video, A, and then B, you will have a chance to hear this information in American 2. So let's go ahead and get into it. Again, this is the West post-Civil War. Women at this time were not given many opportunities still, but especially out west. Where you're seeing a lot of the women's rights stuff start to blow up is in the Northeast. Think of the Seneca Falls Convention. Women at this time were kind of still kept doing household duties, and they were kept to maybe helping a little bit with businesses, but not as much as that they should have. The role of the Chinese. So here's what you're going to see post-Civil War. While there have always been immigrants coming into America, you're going to see a flood of immigrants come into America for these economic opportunities, especially for the chance to work on the biggest man-made infrastructure project in the history of the United States, the Transcontinental Railroad, that's going to connect east to west and west to east. So what you have is an initial wave of Chinese immigrants come over here, start to work on the railroad. Known early on for being dynamite specialists, where they would make sure that the charges were set at exactly the right place, how to use the dynamite in the most efficient way. So they are doing very, very precise work and very, very dangerous work, because you're talking about working on bridges, hollowing out tunnels, that kind of thing. So they're paid pretty well, especially when you compare them to how other immigrants like the Irish were underpaid. So since you have this first wave of Chinese immigrants coming over here and making really good money by immigrant standards of the late 1800s, their family begins to hear about it. And they say, oh, this is a great economic opportunity. And then you have a second, a third, and a fourth wave of Chinese immigrants that flood into America, and the jobs are not there like they are for that first wave or so. Nat Love is America's first black cowboy. It's not Django, starring Jamie Foxx, great movie. But Nat Love is someone who was a former slave, who had taught himself how to read and write. After slavery is over, he heads to the West for opportunity. He actually enters a lottery, wins a horse, and is able to become a cowboy, herding cattle, makes some money, buys him a gun. He becomes an expert marksman. Now, Nat Love is kind of a blend between reality and almost like a tall tale. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about with Nat Love is true. In fact, most all of it is, but it kind of was exaggerated from one generation to the next as these stories about the first black cowboy were told around the campfire. So for example, when Nat Love was captured by some Indians, they say he was spared because they respected his fighting style so much. Was he spared? Did he escape? Sure. Was it because they respected his fighting style? I mean, nobody really knows. Could have very well been true. But anyway, after he kind of escapes death there, he decides to become a pullman on the Transcontinental Railroad, dealing with luggage and whatnot. So that's the story of Nat Love. A lot more to it if you want to dig into it. So silver and gold, we talked about this in American one already, because you had things like the California Gold Rush, and you had that found at Suther's Mill in December 1848. Everybody rushes over here in 1849. This is mainly a review slide here. Of course, you have Levi Strauss invent the blue jean, and then you have silver discovered in southern Nevada. That became known as the Comstock lode of silver. Speaking of review, we talked about the Mormons. Joseph Smith supposedly is given the third book of the Bible, begins spreading the third book, the Book of Mormon, across the Midwest. Many people see it as a cult initially, and he is arrested, killed in prison. Make a very, very complicated story short. He's killed. Brigham Young, who was third in charge behind Joseph Smith and his brother, but they were both killed in prison. Third in charge at the time, and the Mormon Church takes over. It leads them to Utah, of course. Salt Lake City is what they found, and that is still the headquarters of the Mormon Church today. So those last two were reviewed. Jumping back here to the beginning of this little section, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a series of essays that were published in one book called History Frontier in section. But the one essay that has been studied throughout American history since its writing is the significance of the frontier in American history. So what you have Jackson here saying, Frederick Jackson Turner, is that we need to finish developing what we have conquered in the West, but now the frontier the definition of it's going to be expanded to overseas. That means selling our goods in more places. That means opening up military bases in more places. And eventually, when you talk about JFK and the new frontier, it means leaving Earth to push us to send a man to the moon. Land. So you have three big acts/events dealing with land out west. Let's start with the Homestead Act. So the Homestead Act is one of Lincoln's last acts before he is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And he wants to rebuild these southern plantations, albeit without slaves. He knows that things like cotton, tobacco are still an integral part of the economy. So these, especially in Georgia after Sherman's march, are in shambles. So what Lincoln offers is, and the government that controls a lot of these plantations post-Civil War, is that he will give up to 160 acres to families who will go and get these things back up and running in 5 years. That is the Homestead Act. The Morrill Land Grant Act, I'm kind of working from bottom to top on this slide. Morrill Land Grant Act gave federal land to build colleges. At first it was like technical colleges such as community colleges, and of course that expanded into universities. You have like North Carolina A&T. It's a historically black university, but it's also a Morrill Land Grant college. Same with NC State, and I think USC, South Carolina is. Oklahoma Land Rush. The most important and the most tragic of these three. So that if you remember Andrew Jackson studying that in the Trail of Tears, what you had was that forceful relocation, and they actually ended up making Oklahoma work. Well, now that Oklahoma is a thriving place, the American government wants it. So this is going to be where you see a lot of Indians kicked out of Oklahoma, put on reservations in Wyoming, in Idaho, in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, places like that. I'm going to skip ahead a little here. I know I'm jumping around. But that is done through the Dawes Surveillance Act, or the Dawes Act as we usually call it. And this is where you have those reservations outside of Oklahoma, out in the middle of nowhere. You have the American government take that land that they had given to the Indians in Oklahoma and then force a lot of them out into those states I just mentioned. Now, a lot of people want their tribes to fight back. So they kind of tried the same strategy that hasn't worked so far between, if you look back at Metacomet, you look at Tecumseh, you look at Pontiac, they tried to find their most noble chief and try to rally behind him. At this time, it was Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, and he says, we're not going to do it. He has the famous quote, "I will fight no more forever," meaning I'm done fighting. This isn't going to work. And he takes his tribe to Canada, and they're going to survive there. So the Dawes Act ended up, going back to that here, the Dawes Act ended up forcing Indians out of Oklahoma so that the government could take those lands, and they were put on reservations out in the middle of nowhere. So that's 1.1. Let's go to 1.2. Now, AH2 1.2 or AH1 Unit 7.5 1.2, however you want to look at it. Most of you will be watching this in American 1. Transcontinental Railroad. You have two companies building it, Central and Union Pacific. It is finished in Utah, where the two companies are going to meet. Promontory Point is going to be a golden stake driven into the ground, signifying this great accomplishment. The Credit Mobile Scandal. This is where Congress was being asked to give money to build the Transcontinental Railroad. They weren't willing to put up the funds that the two companies needed to build the railroad. And what the companies did is said, hey, what if we give you stock on the back end? In other words, we'll give you stock for funding now. So you take the taxpayer money and you put that toward building the Transcontinental Railroad, and then personally you'll get rich off the stock. Now, that's illegal, so what ends up happening is they get busted on it, and this leads to people, some people going to jail, but the bigger impact is it leads to people distrusting Congress. Now, I know today most people distrust Congress, but in the late 1800s that wasn't necessarily the case. Interlocking Directors, this is when you had the same influential, wealthy people who sat on a board of directors for multiple companies, so it led to the power being concentrated into the hands of a few very rich people. Not really worried about that here, something you'll delve deeper into in American 2. We talked about the Chinese. You also had the Irish immigrants, all these immigrants, and others, but all these immigrants led to that term nativism coming back, this very anti-immigrant sentiment. The railroad makes the United States interdependent, meaning relying on one another instead of independent, of course, relying on yourself. Interdependent, the railroad brought the country closer together, not just travel-wise, but business-wise. It connected eventually, north, south, east, and west. We talked about mining, such as gold and silver. You know what farming is. Ranching, very similar to farming, except it also would involve livestock. The impact of the railroad on the Native American people. So the buffalo are an animal that the most Native American tribes consider sacred. They rely on the buffalo for food, for heat as far as the fur, for utensils out of the bones, for weapons out of the horns. They try to use every single bit of a buffalo that they kill. They don't want to waste this sacred animal. They would try out the skin to create teepees and things of that nature. And you had these tribes tracking the buffaloes, mating patterns, roaming patterns, and they would pass down these patterns from one generation of Indians to the next. Well, once the railroad's built, it scares the buffalo and they scatter. And it completely throws off the mating patterns, the migration patterns, and Indian tribes begin to starve. And it doesn't take them long to figure out it's the building of this railroad that's doing it. Now, the natives call the railroad an iron horse, and some of the more primitive tribes think you can literally fight it and try attacking it with things like bows and arrows. Of course, that's not going to be effective. We just talked about Chief Joseph, the Nez Perce Indians. He doesn't fight the Dawes Act, which kicked Indians out of Oklahoma to reservations out in the middle of nowhere. Instead, he says, I'll fight no more forever. Takes the Nez Perce to Canada. cattle drive. So before the railroad was complete and you could herd cattle into a cattle car and transport them long distance, this is what cowboys were literally paid to do, to herd big groups of cattle from point A to point B, and they would make the most out of it, and they made fairly decent money doing it out west. We're going to talk about some of these Indian wars. Now, if you're in class, this is something we'll dive deep into, especially in American 2. I'm going to hit the highlights here. Battle of Little Bighorn. This takes place in Montana. So the U.S. government discovers gold. I'm sorry, not Montana. As you see here, South Dakota. One of these takes place in Montana. Sand Creek's in Colorado. Wounded Knees in Montana. So my apologies. Little Bighorn is in South Dakota. So the government discovers gold in South Dakota. And there happens to be a Sioux Indian settlement near that gold. Custer, General George Custer, who is in charge of this expedition, wants to go ahead and attack those natives so that the U.S. could claim the gold. So here the Indians have been moved after the Dawes Act. They've been moved after going way back to the Trail of Tears, and the American government is kind of still pestering them here. And of course, it's over monetary gain. So Custer knows he's kind of outmanned, though. So he wants to prove himself to who's in charge of the military at that time, which is William T. Sherman, if you remember the Civil War, Sherman's March. And he telegrams Sherman, says, can I go in and take these Indians out? That way we can gain access to the gold. He says, yes, but you need to wait on reinforcements to arrive, which was going to take a while. He said, okay. He then gets impatient, disobeys a direct order, goes in, tries to kill the natives, fights valiantly, but ends up getting killed at the hands of Chief Sitting Bull. Sand Creek Massacre, this is one of the worst moments as far as the treatment toward the Native Americans, by the U.S. government. Sand Creek is not a very large Indian encampment near Sand Creek in Colorado. And here you had all the male Indians and the warriors out on a hunting trip. The U.S. military runs up on this encampment. They surround it. The people inside are children, elderly. They know they have no chance to fight back without the warriors there, so they literally wave a white flag of surrender, and the military goes in and kills all of them, and they really can't fight back, and the warriors come back to find their families slaughtered and the U.S. military long gone. Wounded Knee, again, this one's in Montana. Sorry for mixing that up with Little Bighorn, which is in South Dakota. You have the military, again, very similar to Sand Creek. It's at this time there are warriors there, but they're trying to cooperate because they know what's happened every time the Indians have fought back against the U.S. military. So at Wounded Knee in Montana, the military runs up on an Indian chief who is doing a ghost dance. They interpret it as a war dance. Actually, what's going on is essentially a funeral. So they go into the Indian encampment, and the Indians are very cooperative, and they agree to hand over their weapons. Shortly after that, the U.S. military slaughters the Indians at Wounded Knee. A Century of Dishonor is kind of to natives what Uncle Tom's Cabin was for slavery. Although, unlike Uncle Tom's Cabin, A Century of Dishonor was important, informative, sad, but almost too late, I would say. So historian Helen Hunt Jackson details every tragedy that occurred to the Indians at the hands of the U.S. government / U.S. military, going back to when it wasn't even the U.S., when it was the British colonies, going back from Metacama all the way through things like Wounded Knee. So all the stuff we talked about in here, just much more in depth and a lot more. So that is going to do it for the American History 1 video notes and the core content of this class. I'll see many of you in American History 2. Thank you. Stay safe. Wear a mask. Thanks for all your hard work. Wash your hands. Have a happy Thanksgiving. If you watch this before then, I doubt you will, but have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, however you want to say it, Happy New Year. And if you're just watching this some random year, thank you for sticking it through to the end. If you have any questions, please email me at bsbell at clevelandcountyschools.org.